As I mentioned before, linear perspective is almost like a foreign language that we have to learn. It's a system that we have to learn. We don't come by it naturally. It was a system invented in the Florentine Renaissance in the 14th and 15th century by Brunelleschi and Alberti and some others. And if we look at these images, one from ancient China, one from ancient Crete, and one from Mesoamerica, again, we see a completely different use of space than linear perspective. In fact, we see three completely different concepts of space. In the example from ancient China, the feeling for the vastness of natural space is being communicated through what we now call aerial perspective, a feeling that is emphasized by the very, very small figure that we see in the lower left-hand corner. Notice that in the example from ancient Crete of the acrobat riding a bull, the image is separated from its environment, from the background, so that we can focus on the action and the grace of the figures. And once again, while nature is being referred to in the example from Mesoamerica, it's not being highlighted. We're not supposed to feel the vastness of space in nature or the details of nature. It's simply being referred to. So we see in the lower part of that image some aqua color referring to some water, above which would be air. The main focus of this space is the activities of the figures in relationship to the animals and what they signify. So, three examples of a non-Western, non-linear perspective use of space, which nonetheless are completely different concepts of space. So while in the West, there was this concern with representing three-dimensional reality on a flat surface, in many, many other cultures, when we think of space or the sense of space that we get, it involves responding to the qualities of the materials, responding to the colors and shapes being used, and responding to the kinds of imagery and what the feeling of that imagery might be like. Certainly before Brunelleschi and Ghiberti, there was a trend in Western European art to use a kind of hierarchical space, as shown in this example, where we see a kind of faux perspective. It's a false or faux perspective because the edge of the table closest to us should be wider, but in this case, or longer. In this case, the edge of the table closest to us is shorter than the edge that's farthest away. The artist did this to kind of attempt to tip the table up to show us what was on the table. Notice the important figures are large and the less important figures in the foreground are smaller. It's kind of an inverted perspective. Here we see two images, one from the 1200s on the left and one from a couple hundred years later on the right. Notice the difference in the ladders. In these two images, we can see how quickly linear perspective took hold once the general principles of perspective were outlined and fleshed out and started to be taken up by artists. So on the left-hand side, we see kind of this faux perspective along with showing a ladder from its most readable point of view, front on. But then on the right-hand side, we start to see a ladder being shown in what we might call perspective. But notice the perspective in this image on the right isn't consistent. We see a rose-colored or pink wall, and behind the pink wall, we see a set of steps. So at first, the ladder is coming up in front of the wall, but then somehow magically ends up being right alongside the steps. So that doesn't spatially make sense. Though it probably does make sense for the religious concept that is being conveyed in the image. It's still not exactly true to linear perspective. Remember at the beginning of this presentation, I said that space has meaning. Space conveys meaning. So in the case of ancient Egypt and other cultures, using a hierarchical concept of space, what is bigger might be the most important. So then the question arises, what, in a sense, is the meaning of linear perspective? Nowadays, every fourth or fifth grader learns the little railroad diagram showing how the railroad tracks seem to meet and disappear on the horizon line, and learn about vanishing points. When linear perspective was first discovered, or rather rediscovered, we see elements of linear perspective as far back as the ancient Greeks. What meaning might it have had? Certainly there was the thrill of representing a three-dimensional reality on a flat surface. And this was made possible by the rediscovery of classical learning from the ancient Greeks and Romans that was lost during the Middle Ages in Europe, but preserved in Islam and in Muslim countries, which was then reintroduced into the Christian West. And as the principles of linear perspective were formulated and used, they were seen as an indication, as an insight into a glimpse of the Christian God's original master plan of sacred reality. It was a sign, in a sense, of the Christian God's plan for the universe. So once again, just as with hierarchical space, we see, in this case, linear perspective, the space of linear perspective, being used to convey a certain set of ideas, a certain set of values, a certain kind of hierarchy. In this case, a set of religious ideas and values that we no longer really associate with learning linear perspective. So at the birth of the linear perspective concept of space, we also have this kind of association where the rationality of the perspective grid equals kind of the rationality of the universe, which is a mirror of the divine plan. There are lots of books that you can read that talk about these kind of ideas. One that I could recommend, The Mirror, the Window, and the Telescope by Samuel Edgerton, is really a pretty good read. Just a few more points about linear perspective before we see how artists have gone beyond that idea and then explored other concepts of space that we haven't yet talked about. Linear perspective is a good tool for representing three-dimensional reality, but it's also kind of a very limited tool. The reality that it represents isn't the reality that we experience with our eyes and our mind. It's an artificial reality. So imagine your head if it were in a vise and you couldn't turn your head left or right. You could only look in one direction forward. That's kind of how linear perspective works. It's the view that you would get. If you only had one eye, your head were in a vise, and all you could do was look forward. As a result, linear perspective only works within a certain angle, a certain cone of vision, which is roughly 60 degrees radiating out from your eyes. So in the illustration at the bottom, we see a horizon line. We see two vanishing points, VP1 and VP2. And then below that, we see something marked SP. That's the station point, or that's actually where your eyes are, the viewpoint from your eyes. If you follow the lines from SP to both of the vanishing points, everything that's represented within those angles is probably going to look like it's in perspective and not distorted. But once you get outside of that cone of vision, then using the principles of linear perspective will lead to some really strange things. It will lead to a distorted box like we see on the far left-hand side in this illustration. So linear perspective is an artificial system that only works within an essentially 60-degree cone of vision. Also, we have to remember that it's artificial because we have two eyes, not one eye, and each of those eyes has its own visual field. Our left eye has a left visual field, and our right eye has a right visual field that our brain then brings together into one coherent image of what we're seeing. So once again, outside a certain cone of vision, the principles of linear perspective will lead to distortion. But as we see in this illustration, towards the center of that cone of vision, things start to take on their proper proportion and proper perspective. So here we have an image that is in 1-point perspective, well within the 60-degree cone of vision that I mentioned. But once we zoom out and our cone of vision becomes greater than 60 degrees, we start to see all kinds of distortion. Notice how a skewed or distorted concept of space can be used to convey meaning. Here we see Jean Lowe's painting Overstock. It's a very large painting in the collection of the Nora Eccles Harrison Museum of Art here on campus. You see a large space that looks like a church or a cathedral with painted murals and panels on the side, very ornate, and a chandelier in the center. And below you have a convenience store or some kind of store that has been installed with consumer items on sale. And while a simplistic reading of this painting might be that our values become skewed when we start to worship consumer goods rather than maybe spiritual ideas, you should stop and, if you go see this painting, look at what exactly is represented in the murals. And then the reading becomes much more sophisticated and much more involved. But again, the skewed space, the distorted space, lends itself and reinforces this commentary or this investigation into how we make meaning in life.